Hi, my name is Till,
And my name is Shajan.
and we're doing a discussion of Max Weber's Society and Economy about the chapter Household, Neighborhood, and Kin Group. And we're doing this for the sociology course of our Professor Maria José del Pino Espejo. And we are from the University of Twente. Currently doing an Erasmus semester at Universidad Pablo de Olavide de Sevilla. All right. Maximilian, or often called only Max, Karl Emil Weber, was born on April the 21st in 1864 in Erfurt, Germany, and died on June the 14th in 1920 in Munich, Germany. He is widely recognized as one of the founders of modern sociology, and while he was very influential there, he was primarily an economist, an historian, and a jurist. The book Sociology and Economy was published in 1921 and 1922 in 4 different parts, posthumously by his wife Marianne Weber, who we also know to be a very, very important sociologist. Sociology and economy is one of Weber's most important contributions to modern sociology. It can be understood as a framework for understanding social, economic, and individual action in modern society. And it has many definitions and classifications, especially in regards to government and power and social structures that are still used today in sociology, history, law, and political science. Yes, we're going to talk about the chapter 3, Household, Neighborhood, and Kin Group, which spans from page 356 to page 369. The household the chapter is divided into 4 parts. The first is the household, familial, capitalistic, and communistic solidarity. And it should be said, the most important types of group relationships it is about the most important types of groups and their relationship between economy and those groups. The typical father-mother-child relationship often appears very natural to us at first, but without the economic context, these relationships are weak and unstable. And so if we separate the household from as a unit of economy, yes, these mother-father-child relationship, Weber basically goes on and into detail about why they are unstable, basically saying that the father relationship cannot exist, or the father-child relationship cannot exist without a stable economic household. And also saying that, for example, biological-based brothers or siblings, it's not about biology, it's about common maintenance. So if these people grow up together. And so he goes further into the topic by talking about marriage and basically specific rules. He says that the specific rules of marriage are determined by laws and often sacred traditions, and that marriage can only be defined in reference to other groups. He writes that marriage is the antithesis to other sexual relationships. And he remarks that the existence of marriage basically means 2 things, that relationships against the will of the families of the husband and the wife are often forbidden and can be punished quite severely. And secondly, that the existence of marriage basically means the exclusion of children born outside of this marriage, outside of wedlock. That means children born within the marriage, within the stable sexual relationship, are treated as part of the economic, the religious, and political community when they grow up, while basically children born outside of wedlock don't get any of those or get very different treatment. A very, very good example for that are the Middle Ages, where children born outside of wedlock were considered bastards and stood to inherit nothing. Yes, as previously said, the specifics of marriage, who's allowed to marry whom, and when is a marriage legitimate, those are all factors that are determined by local traditions and laws of that said specific group. He then goes on to basically talk about households, and this is quite a quite important part in the text. So I'm going to actually read an excerpt here, because what Weber previously wrote about was basically why solely sexual relationships outside of the context of economic relationships, such as the husband and wife relationship or the father-child relationship, does not constitute a household on its own without the economic context. So Weber writes on page 358. He writes, sexual relationships and the relationships between children based on the fact of their common parent or parents can engender social action only by becoming the normal, though not the only basis of specific economic organization, the household. So yeah, Weber basically says that just because you are siblings or just because you're married, that doesn't constitute a household. Very specific to a household is the economic aspect of it. And a household, well, the fundamental basis of a household are authority and loyalty. And, well, actually, I got ahead of myself there. He goes on further by basically explaining that a household is not a primitive institution, that households, the way he understands it, first came up when organized agriculture began. So nomad tribes didn't have a household in the way we have it today, or even doesn't have the same characteristics. The household is most commonly economic and requires continuous and intensive social action. And the fundamental, as I said before, the fundamental basis of a household is loyalty and authority. And authority in this case is basically made up from two parts, which is authority derived from superior strength, such as, well, Weber goes on to define it such as authority of man against women. It could be argued now, of course, that isn't really a basis for authority, but in the society back then it definitely was. But he defines it further by basically saying able-bodied against less able-bodied, or adult against children. These are all basically examples for a second category, which is authority derived from practical knowledge or experience. So the elders know more than the children, and therefore they have authority. And yeah, that's just the first category. And now the second is loyalty. And loyalty, he defines loyalty as a subject, as well. Loyalty is something that subjects hold towards authority, or yeah. And in this, he also very interestingly remarks in this chapter that it's it's more of a side note, it feels like. But if you read it, he writes that the respect for elders. I'm paraphrasing now, but he basically writes that respect for elders finds its way into religion. Loyalty towards a patrimonial towards something patrimonial. It shows a domestic character. So, for example, God is often, or the Christian God is often referred to as the Father. That was actually very interesting, but it's not the point of this chapter. So furthermore, he writes about economic and personal relationships, household in its true and its pure form, in quotation marks, of course, because pure can be it's basically, it depends on the social context, but in its pure form, it implies solidarity in dealing with the outside, and basically communism of property and consumption of everyday goods within. He defines this as household communism. And the solidarity to the outside, Weber mentions the example of middle and northern Italian city-states in the Middle Ages, because in those states, for example, if the household owes a debt, everyone in this household, even if it's just apprentices that are contractually part of this family, they are all liable, which is basically the historic source for joint liability as we know it today. They were all liable towards the debitor of this debt, basically. And this is the kind of solidarity to the outside. The family is a whole. Everybody is responsible in that sense. And communism, or household communism, of property and consumption of everyday goods, he basically describes it as everybody contributes what they can and they take what they need. An example of this would be if there's a pantry in a family home. It's not just handed out, or not. It's not everything is owned by the breadwinner of that family. It's the family's pantry, and if you're hungry, you're gonna get some food out of that pantry. He also basically has some examples here. Inheritance, for example, if in the Middle Ages, in the classical pure household form, if someone died in those times, everything this person owned went to the household. And if somebody leaves in that time or is expelled from the family, they cannot claim their share of the household anymore. And he describes an immortal household that keeps going on because everybody contributes, and that's where the communism, or the household communism, comes from, because everything is owned by the social group. Everything belongs to the family and not to the individual. Yeah, this is basically. He also describes that's a very important factor that I forgot. He also linked this to, like, nowadays to modern households, or modern households by the time he wrote this book, which was in around the 1920s. Nowadays it's limited to consumption. Back then it was the household communism was basically everything. And this was also very interesting. He goes on to say that back in the day, common residence was a very important feature of the household. But today, with increased sizes of households, and that basically creates division and separation, and that is basically nowadays. It's designed by or it's they take care of that by compromise, and the family looks after each other, and common residence is basically in the modern world no longer a thing. Yeah, so that was the first part of that chapter that is divided into 4 parts.
Okay, then I'll continue with the second, third, and fourth parts, who are a bit shorter than the first one. The second one is about the neighborhood, an unsentimental economic brotherhood, it says. And I'll start out with reading a short paragraph. The household meets the everyday demands for goods and labor. In a self-sufficient agrarian economy, a good deal of the extraordinary demands at special occasions during natural calamities and social emergencies are met by social action that transcends the individual household, the assistance of the neighborhood. For us, the neighborhood is not only the natural one of the rural settlement, but every permanent or ephemeral community of interest that derives from physical proximity. Of course, if not specified further, we refer most of the time to the neighborhood of households settled close to one another. Yes, so basically it means that the assistance of the neighborhood is social action that transcends that is bigger than the individual household and transcends the understanding of being responsible for your individual household. And also that if it's not specified further, like you said, if you don't have a special case, then we understand, as it's also like natural to us, that the household is, the neighborhood is the household or households, the accumulation of households that are settled close to one another. And then also there are very different forms of households. For example, farms, villages, or the city center, or also slums. And logically, these different households, these different forms of neighborhoods lead to different intensities, different degrees of intensities of social actions. So, for example, the neighborhood in the city center is there's not as much as an intensity in social actions than, for example, in a village. Exactly. So what neighborhood means is that there's a mutual dependence in a neighborhood in case of distress. So they're like dependent on one another, every household in a neighborhood. And the neighbor is understood as the typical helper in need. And this is also understood from Max Weber in a primarily economic sense. So if one neighbor has problems financially, then most of the time, or in some cases, or in the normal case, the neighbor helps the other neighbor out. And then he also answers why he would do that. And this is because the neighbor who helps the other one out is probably thinking about what happens to me if I'm in trouble someday further in time. Then I also have the how you say it, the reliance and the guarantee that the other neighbor is helping him out too. So it's more like a guarantee. And in this case, like if an exchange happens, then you also have the rule, the saying that brothers do not bargain, which basically eliminates the economic or financial price determination, so that you like bargain the help of the one neighbor to the other one up against each other. This is not the case, so it's just we help each other out and we don't care about how high the price was for that. But Weber also points out that a neighborhood is not always necessarily a brotherhood. As he said often, like it could also be very hostile if there is a conflict or something. For example, if one neighbor didn't fulfill his or fulfill the favor of helping the other neighbor out or anything else, then there could be like a breach of trust and a break in trust, and this could also lead to like a very intense conflict between neighbors. So it's not always a very it's ideal, but it's not always the case that neighbors are like within the neighborhood are friendly with one another and help each other out. Yeah, and you also said that neighborhoods are not always an economic group necessarily. And then also important is that neighborhoods are, from Weber's understanding, the natural basis of a local community. So if many neighborhoods in a local community unite, then they form a local community. Or they also become itself politically active and form public schools or do religious functions, stuff like that. Yeah, but in the essence, neighborly social action is like just economic brotherhood in case of need. What I pointed out before, that if another neighbor is in need, you help him out. Then we come to the regulation of sexual relations in the household. And Weber says that this is it is the early substantial inroads into unmitigated communist house authority. So the sexual relations he meant. And yeah, this proceeds from sexual claims of the male over the female, which leads to like communist house authority, but it doesn't. So it doesn't come from, for example, economic motives. And then he says that any kind of communist sexual freedom is banished from a house in which there is a communist property ownership. So in houses like that, or households like that, there is no, the sexual freedom is banished. What he meant by that is, for example, sexual relations between siblings or relatives. But then he points out that this is actually allowed, or the institution of a marriage is allowed between siblings or relatives in households that are prominent, or especially households that are royal. And then he also points out why that is the case, or like the reason for that, and that is because these households want to preserve the economic resources. It is also like especially in royal households in the Middle Ages, it was said that siblings could marry in order to maintain the bloodline. But he points out that it's especially because of just to preserve the economic resources. Yeah, and this. He also points out that in the case of households, it was a very early closure of sexual relations, like within the household. So this was very early abolished, and then also the sexual sphere was further narrowed, and this actually imposed the first decisive limitations to domestic authority. Right. Then we come to the fourth chapter, and this is the kin group and its economic effects on the household. And there I have like another paragraph to read out. And Max Weber says the kin group is not as natural a group as the household or the neighborhood. As a rule, its social action is discontinuous and lacks association. In fact, the kin group proves that social action is possible even if the participants do not know each other, and action is merely passive, refraining from sexual relations, for example. Right. So, yeah, he points out that the kin group is not as natural as a group as the households or the neighborhoods. And this, he meant by that there's often not the same strength of connection in a kin group than, for example, in a household where there is like a relative, a family connection or a marriage connection. Then also that like the action of a kin group can be very easily be discontinuous and lacks association, but this then proves even that social action is possible, even if, and this is also very possible in a kin group, that the participants do not know each other. Yeah, so passive action. And then he explains the kin membership, and this is like if you are in a kin group, then you are prohibited to marry within the kin group, and also the connection between participants or members of a kin group is, for example, common marks of identification, which can also be a common descent of a natural object. So they believe they are common descendants of, for example, an animal. And then furthermore, they are also prohibited from eating that animal. Another rule of members of a kin group is that they are not allowed to combat one another. So within this kin group, there is also the guarantee. So the kin group guarantees for the individual of a kin group they guarantee their security and also their legal personality. And if, for example, a neighborhood coincides with the kin group, then oftentimes the members of kin groups are retaining the appellable rights in relation to domestic authority. So, for instance, they can veto for or against, better to say, against the sale of property, for example. Or they can determine which daughter to marry to another person. And then also very important, Max Weber points out that the most typical mean in a kin group, or like the most typical tool they use is collective self-help. But as I pointed out before, a kin group can be very, very unorganized and not as close as, for example, a household. And so Max Weber points out here that a kin group could also be seen as a counter image of a household. And then in a kin group, he says that domestic authority derives of a child, or derives from the matrilineal or the patrilineal descent. So if he comes from the mother or the father, and in most cases, the father has the domestic authority and the mother only in very, very rare cases. And it's also seen, there you can also see like the lower rank of females in a kin group. And this can also be very clearly seen in the fact that there's also prostitution involved. So female household members are often sold, or like the sexual work of a woman is sold in exchange for services and goods, for example. So yes, that was the part of the kin group, and also the chapter.
That was the chapter. Yeah.
That was the chapter in general.
We have our sources here. This is basically just where we found Weber's book. We mentioned some page numbers. The page numbers are, if you look up the book, the source, it will lead you to basically a site called archive.org, where, well, they basically have this version in English, also in German. If you can read German, they have the English version there. The page numbers correspond to the version in archive.org. Yes, very interesting chapter.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and
just
bye-bye.